Good afternoon. I'm Anuj Mehrotra, Dean of the George Washington University School of Business, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this final episode in our fall season of George Talks Business Series. Our guest today is Ms. Stephanie von Friedeburg, Interim Managing Director and Executive Vice President and Chief Operating Officer at the International Finance Corporation, or IFC. Thank you very much for joining us today, Stephanie.
Very happy to be here. How are you?
Wonderful. And again, I appreciate you being on the show today. And I certainly would like to be able to talk about your role at the IFC. But before we do that, can we talk a little bit about the beginning of your career? Can you tell us how and where you started?
It's an interesting question, Anuj, and certainly never expected that I would sit where I sat. I actually did my undergraduate just up the road from GW. I got an undergraduate degree in economics and Russian area studies and didn't want to work for a three-letter agency, so went to New York, was an analyst on Wall Street, and like all good analysts, was told, go get your MBA. So I went and tried to get an MBA, and after I had applied, the University of Pennsylvania reached out and said, it had this interesting dual degree program where you could get a master's in Russian area studies while you got your MBA. And would I be interested in that? And so I went to Penn and got my master's at Wharton and the Lauder Institute, and then decided that I would go back to Wall Street, but nobody was working in Eastern Europe. So a friend of mine said, well, I've just heard about this neat little organization called the IFC, and it sounds like something that would be right up your alley. So I interviewed and thought, well, I'll do this for 6 months and maybe a year, and then I'll go back to Wall Street. And 29 years later, I'm still here. And my career has really been all over the place in the World Bank Group, and it's been very rich and exciting, and it's been an honor to have spent this much time in the institution.
That's great. That's actually very, very wonderful to hear that you've been there for 29 years. And of course, it would be good to perhaps give some of our viewers, especially the students who are looking at various things, a little bit about what the World Bank does and what is your role specifically at the IFC right now. Of course, you have been you have served in many roles. Of course, served as CIO and Vice President for Information Technology Solutions at the World Bank Group before. Would love to hear what led you to the leadership role in IT. And of course, a little bit about what the World Bank does and what IFC's role is today.
So when people think about the World Bank, I think they don't actually understand that there are 5 institutions that constitute the World Bank Group. So there's IBRD, which is the Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which is the heart of the World Bank, founded after the Second World War to help countries in Europe rebuild. IDA, which is an organization that helps the poorest countries in the world, but does very similar work that IBRD does. ICSID, which is a negotiations facility. MEGA, which provides guarantees, and IFC. So IFC was founded in 1956 by a very small group of our shareholders with the idea that if you really wanted to create economic growth in emerging markets and jobs, you needed a better and stronger private sector. So we are the private sector arm of the World Bank Group, and we think of ourselves as some days a commercial bank, some days an investment bank, some days an equity house. So we really cover the capital stack in private sector investment, from seeds, startup, and VCs, all the way to very structured bond transactions at the higher end of the corporate spectrum. And we do that without any government guarantees, all private sector led, all over the world. We have about a $60 billion active portfolio, evenly dispersed throughout the world. So it's a very interesting and exciting place to work if you want to do investment commercial banking and you want to do it in emerging markets.
Clearly, you already have a wonderful lens to be able to understand the world economy and to be able to promote the economic growth around the world. Let me ask you, however, that given if this is especially pertinent now with COVID-19, from your lens on how do you feel would be the impact of COVID-19 on the global economy, especially the impact on the developing world. And in particular, I would love to hear a little bit about how you feel from your perspective, the pandemic affecting the fragile countries. You talked about some of the poorer countries, but what about the fragile countries? What is happening to the countries that are facing multiple crises right now?
Yeah. It's an interesting question, Anuj, and it's difficult to say, how do we rekindle the global economy? I actually think that we may lose as much as a decade of development gains. And we are going to see, we predict at least 150 million people fall into extreme poverty. So living on less than $1.90 a day. That's at least 10 years, if not more, of development growth. And every time I turn the corner, I see another major development milestone slipping out of our reach. The IMF's latest prediction is that the global economy would contract by 4.5%. That was October, and that was before the second or third, however you want to count them, wave of shutdowns. And so I think that's a very optimistic number. What does that mean for our countries of operation? Well, these countries entered this crisis pretty heavily debt burdened, and they have no fiscal space to continue to create the stimulants that's necessary to keep the economies afloat, but maybe even more to ensure that they can create the economic jobs that need to be created to bring us out of this crisis. And my personal view is the only way we're actually going to make that happen as a result is through the private sector. So I said in the very beginning, I've been in development finance for 29 years. And for many years, the private sector was never seen as the real engine for development finance and for creating good development. But I came out of our annual meetings in October this year really believing that the world needs the private sector in ways that we've never needed it before to actually create the jobs and economic growth to pull us out of this recession.
So I think, there are multiple questions around what you're talking about in terms of the private sector, and we'll get to an interesting part about what from your lens, you are seeing, for example, the private sector's contribution to the vaccine development maybe. But before we do that, I know when the pandemic hit IFCs, for IFC kind of created a 3R relief, restructure, and recovery program. So I would love to hear a little bit about how the COVID-19 response enhanced IFC's 3.0 strategy. And quite frankly, beyond that, how is it changing the IFC's business model? Because, it's impacting, not just the impact is on the countries and the world overall, but also the businesses are restructuring and changing and adapting. So would love to hear some of what IFC itself is experiencing and how is it changing IFC as an institution?
One of the beauties of being an institution that's founded with public money is that a lot of people look at what you do. So we have something called the Independent Evaluation Group, and they look back over different periods of time in which we've made investments. They look back over different portfolios. One of the things that they did was go back to the 2008-2009 fiscal crisis and did a review of what was IFC's role in trying to help us get out of the crisis. One of the interesting things that they discovered is that IFC, while we say we're a countercyclical investor, actually wasn't particularly countercyclical, and we didn't really lean into the crisis. We protected our own balance sheet. So I felt it was super important that as we looked at this crisis, we have ample capital. We just got a very large capital increase from our shareholders, $5.5 billion, largest capital increase we've ever had. I felt like it was really time for us to lean in and say, how do we do more? So we created this 3R framework to think about how do we intercede at different points of the crisis. And the first was really relief. I mean, what we were seeing and what we continue to see is liquidity issues in our countries, particularly in the private sector. So we created an $8 billion facility. And we've done facilities before in crises, but typically they have been designated for financial institutions to on-lend to SMEs, because we know that reaching the SMEs and the informal sector is critical to continuing economic growth in many of these countries. We've never really done anything in the real sector. So this time we set aside $2 billion to lend to real sector companies. We're about halfway through the facility. So in 6 months, we've dispersed $4 billion. It's moving fast. And I think that our board will be considering an expansion of that program because the crisis is extending. What's really interesting about it, which gets to one of your other questions, is how did we operate differently? We really had to pivot how we were going to operate. Historically, it took us 275, 280 days to get a project done. The average project under that facility got done in 69 days because we redesigned front to back how we actually look at the individual credits, how we take risk, how we evaluate that risk, and how we make decisions. So really interesting learning, I think, for the organization writ large when we come out of the crisis as well. But then the second piece is the restructuring piece. which is we know that the liquidity crises are moving to insolvency. There's not good insolvency regimes anywhere in the world. So we work really closely with our World Bank colleagues to think about how do we create insolvency regimes that allows assets to be reallocated as quickly as possible or save the companies that are savable so that we generate as many jobs as quickly as possible to get us out. And to that end, we're putting together a couple of different funds. One is a CDO that will help the larger companies get access to credit, again, because we know they're the largest employers, and another one to provide equity because we know that equity is in pretty short supply. And then the third piece is really how do we come out more resiliently? And this, as you rightly said, is very much linked to our strategy. So one of the things that we believe fundamentally is that in the poorest countries in the world, there aren't enough bankable projects. And there are impediments to those bankable projects, some of which are policy and regulatory related. So part of our 3.0 strategy is to work much more closely with the bank, to use their development policy lending to really push the envelope and get a better policy and regulatory environment to attract private investment. And then ourselves to actually work upstream, what we call working upstream, to actually create the projects that we can then finance and that others can finance in the confines of better policy and regulation. So an example of that might be our Scaling Solar program, where we have created standard documents and had started in Zambia, but have moved to 7 other countries where we auction solar opportunities to different international organizations who we know quite well from other parts of the world. They bid and we help finance large solar parks around the world. So just an idea about how we do those kinds of things.
Very, very interesting and intriguing. Let me switch a little bit, gears a little bit. The Moderna, for example, has come up with trying to petition for emergency, distribution of the vaccine that they have developed, and a couple of other vaccines are looking very promising and are in that phase. From your perspective, I think what is IFC's role going to be in ensuring that the vaccine is available in the countries of operation? And I would just love to hear a little bit about the logistics that may be involved to deliver the vaccine all over the world. I mean, some of these vaccines are requiring to be transported at very, very, very cold temperatures and refrigerations that may not be very suitable, for example, for some parts of the world. So if you can tell us a little bit more about the global health platform and how it helps with the delivery and access to the vaccine, that'll be very interesting.
And it's a tough question to answer because I'm not sure that we know the answer yet. But one of the things we did know, the start of the crisis, we were actually being approached first by countries who were saying, we need to buy equipment, we need to buy PPE, we need ventilators. The Central African Republic has 3 ventilators for 5 million people. We have 179,000 ventilators in this country by comparison. So we knew that in the poorest countries of the world, they needed PPE, they needed equipment, they needed help, and we needed to find a way to do that. So we created the Global Health Platform. Our first thought was, we'll tackle the equipment and the PPE. But as we began to put the Global Health Platform together, we also realized there was an opportunity for us to help with vaccines. And it's not yet clear exactly what role we'll play. There's a lot of different parties. There's Gavi, there's the COVAX facility. The World Bank has actually made available a $12 billion facility for countries to help them purchase the vaccines. But what we do know is the vaccines are going to have to be produced in many different places. So we went to our board and said, we want to create a global health platform, $4 billion platform, that will, again, expedite the way that we do our processing, so very much like our COVID fast track facility, but that would work in both the developed world and the developing world. So typically IFC does not invest in the developed world. We only invest in emerging markets. But we knew that some of this stuff had to be created in the developed world and sold to the developing world. And we could follow the chain of money by understanding how Gavi, the COVAX facility, the World Bank would be lending money to countries to purchase the actual vaccine or the PPE or the equipment. So now what we're trying to do is to say to ourselves, where in our countries of operation can we invest? So just to put a really wild number out there, you need 89 million masks a month produced between now and the end of the crisis. And we know that in all of our countries of operation, we have companies that are capable of doing that. So we invested in a very interesting company, a garment manufacturer in Sri Lanka, which has converted much of its factory to creating masks. We've invested in an interesting company in India called Biologic E, which makes vaccines. And they are a very prominent vaccine manufacturer. So we're helping them expand childhood vaccines now with the hope that if one of the more traditional AstraZeneca drugs gets up and going, they may ultimately be the partner of choice, and we can help them then produce that vaccine. On the more advanced vaccines, I think the distribution is going to be really interesting. The one thing that I would say that I'm most intrigued by is the only high storage, highly cooled storage vaccine that has been invented and actually used is the Ebola vaccine. And bear in mind, it was used in some of the most difficult parts of Africa, and it actually reached the people it needed. So my sense is that we are going to be able to get the vaccine where it needs to go. The question is, how long is it going to take us, and how quickly can we produce enough of the vaccine with high enough efficacy to actually inoculate enough of the world?
I mean, this is going to be perhaps one of the most impactful contributions that collectively we can all make, and I think IFC is good luck to that. Good luck to you in organizing this even more as we go along. Let me change subjects a little bit for some of my students who really would love to hear a little bit more about what IFC has been doing for a while, which is impact investing. So if you could talk a little bit about the main principles. And how do you create ways for measuring the impact? What do our students need to know if they are interested in this space and in developing accountability and measurement frameworks? So that'll be good to hear from you for our students.
So Anuj, I'm fond of saying that IFC is the mother of all impact investors. We've been doing, we believe that you can do well and do good at the same time. And we've been doing that since 1956. And over many years, we have advanced our measurement systems to think through how do we measure impact and how do we ensure that, again, it's public money that we're investing. How do we ensure that we're actually creating the best development outcomes for the investments in which we're putting our money? So we now have something called our AIM rating, which is our anticipated impact measurement system. And we actually come into a project. So in every single project, we do the financial analysis. We know what the expected IRR or the RAROC on the debt facility is. But we give another score, and the score is called the AIM score, which is our anticipated impact. So how much impact are we going to have? And then when we think through what we do in any given year, we think about it as a portfolio of investments. So in some instances, we might have higher impact and lower return. In other instances, we might have higher return and a little lower impact, but we plot those on a graph so that we can look in any given year about what we're doing. And we have a really interesting conversation with our board around, where do we want to be in this scatter plot? Do we want to be moving, north and east? Do we want to be moving north? Do we want to be moving west? Given the financial sustainability of the balance sheet in any given period of time. So now might be a good time for us to think about what impacts would the COVID crisis have on our balance sheet. So do we want to have a little less impact and a little more return to make sure that we're sound? Do we want to have more impact because we have enough capital and fewer returns? So we really think through it that way. And then we created a series of impact principles for investing. And we have over 100 of some of the biggest investors in the world who have now signed up to our principles. And one of the things that we've learned, over our 65 years of operation is that you have to invest with intent, you have to measure that intent, and you have to exit at a profit. So those are really the key fundamentals of our impact principles. And we ask anyone who signs up to say, this is the impact we expect to have. This is how we're going to measure, use an independent measuring entity to measure that, and then prove on the back end that you can actually have a financial return through that process. And, to me, the most interesting thing about impact investing is that different capital owners have different ideas about what they want to do in relation to impact, which makes it a much harder and more complex process to think through. So if you're George Washington University, your endowment might have interested in helping children in Ward 7 and 8 in the district because you want to think about early childhood and childhood education. You might, have an endowment in the arts, and therefore your impact is going to be helping, young African artists find ways to bring their art into the international world. So there's lots of different ways to think about impact, and I think it makes it much harder to measure as well.
Right. So very well said. And I think those principles are extremely easy and good, and not easy, but certainly very important ones to follow, as you are pointing out. One of the areas where IFC has made a big impact overall is one of the world's largest financiers of climate-focused projects for developing countries. Some of our audience would love to hear some of the latest and most current work IFC may be doing around climate change. And it is, and related to that, it is one of the earliest issuers of green bonds, for example. So can you talk a little bit about what IFC is doing to tackle climate change for our audience?
So we've been thinking about climate for a long time. It's not necessarily new to us, but I do think it's becoming even more important as we think about how do we come through the crisis and build back more resiliently. In many instances, I believe we have an opportunity to rethink some of the things that we've done, but we need to move fast because, we've lowered GHG emissions by 7% because we're all staying at home. And my sense is the minute that the world economy kicks back in, that 7% is going to go away. And meeting the zero target by the middle of the century, to me, looks virtually impossible if we don't find ways to do things differently. So we have made some pretty serious commitments to climate. First, as I mentioned earlier, we got a large capital increase. And as part of that capital increase, we committed that by 2030, 35% of all the business we do will be climate related. And we have subsequently said, gosh, maybe we should pull that goal closer in. So by 2025, we're saying that we will have 35% of the business that we do climate related. So we actually have a team of client experts that we have embedded across our entire organization. And we look at all sorts of different things, but we think about clean cities, we think about clean transport, we think about smart agri. Anywhere that we can make progress on climate, we push very hard to do so. Interestingly, we've talked a little bit about power, but at the heart of our power strategy is renewable energy. And over the course of the last 10 years, we've actually built our power portfolio to a point where 70% of what we do now is renewable energy, either wind, solar, or hydro. So you're seeing us do more and more in that space. But the other thing that we want to do, since we have both our operations portfolio, but we also have our treasury portfolio, is figure out how we get asset owners to come along with us in this process. So 10 years ago, we signed up to the Green Bond Principles, and we just celebrate our 10th anniversary. We've issued a little over $10 billion in bonds in 20 different currencies. They've supported over 200 projects that IFC has done. And we continue to push the envelope on the green bonds and extend from green bonds to green loans. So we help our clients issue green bonds now, and we'll be an anchor investor in those. But now we've actually created, think of a green commercial loan where we can actually lend money to companies as they green a piece of their operations or a piece of their business. We've also spent a very substantive amount of time with our financial institutions, knowing again that they're on lending to SMEs for lots of different purposes. And we now have about $12 billion of exposure through financial institutions that's specifically ring-fenced for climate-related investment. And on top of that, we give advisory services, so assistance to the financial institutions to really think through how they build a climate portfolio, how they pull companies away from coal, and how they continue to support the growth of a green recovery.
Excellent. Thanks, Stephanie, for that. I want to also take this opportunity to hear from you about Africa a little bit, in particular in terms of the role of technology and the digital innovation that is really potentially changing the course of development in emerging markets as in African countries right now. And if you could take us a few years from now on where you think and how this will all impact Africa, and what would the economy potentially, hopefully, look like if the investments are made appropriately, and so take us through that on what IFC feels how digital economy is going to be impacting Africa in the next few years.
So, Anuj, this is my favorite subject. You said, you asked me, I think early on, how did I ever become the CIO of the World Bank Group? I actually ran our telecom and tech team for many years and did a lot of the investing in mobile. And I saw the evolution of mobile technology. When I started in my job, early 2000s, there were 300 million cell phones in the world. And we looked at a really interesting project in Jamaica. And we went to the board, and the board said, why are you giving luxury items to poor people? And over the course of the 10 years that I did that job, we saw mobile phones go from 300 million to 3 billion. And we saw the world change really dramatically as we went, as in particular in Africa, where we leapfrogged landline technology, fixed technology, and went directly to wireless. And again, this was, you asked about the 3.0 strategy. This for me was the learning in 3.0, because what I actually learned as an investor was that with the right policy and regulation, you could actually create whole industries in countries. So if you think about very early on, the bank worked in Nigeria to issue the mobile licenses. We came in and then invested in Celtel and MTN. And it ended up being almost 3% of the GDP of the country. So I think technology has huge potential. But where the development community as a whole, I think, fell down and kind of left Africa stranded is we raised our heads and said, look, everybody has mobile. Now we can actually create the entrepreneurs and the companies that build on the back of mobile. You saw M-Pesa come around, and people said, okay, now we'll have digital banking, digital wallets, fintech will come. But we stopped pushing the policy and regulation in the poorest countries of the world, while the developed world continued to invest. So as we went from 2G to 2.5G to 3G to 4G to 5G, many countries in Africa remained on 2G networks. They don't have the undersea cable to connect them to the rest of the world, and the digital infrastructure is really lacking. As a matter of fact, I think 13 of the countries with the least connectivity in the world are in Africa. So if we believe, and I think we've witnessed as a result of the COVID crisis, the importance that the digital economy will play as we come out of this crisis. All the retailers who are moving away from bricks and mortar and moving to online, brand new companies who are springing up and creating really interesting opportunities. Without digital infrastructure, Africa will be left behind, and left behind even further. So our first port of call is our Moonshot program, which is being done jointly with the bank and the IFC. And the intention is to really push to build the right digital infrastructure in Africa. But what needs to come with that are two other components. One, we need to ensure that the citizens actually have the digital literacy to be able to use applications as they're developed. And this is critical. So for me, when I look at the number of children who are out of school, 230 million children in Africa are out of school. If they can't read and write and they don't have basic literacy, teaching them to use digital devices and digital applications will be super hard. So that's another focus that we need to have. And then the third piece is building the entrepreneurial systems. So finding the software designers, the programmers who can actually use technology to create solutions on the continent. And we actually, I mentioned earlier, we really invest across the capital stack. So some of the best things that I think we do are in the VC space. And we have invested in some really interesting companies in Africa. One that I would throw out to you, which is super interesting, is a company called Andela, which actually creates software engineers and software designers. And then they go back and they work remotely for some of the big software companies, the Microsofts and the Googles of the world, and really learn how to program. They're actually then creating a solid skill set on the continent so that we can continue to see interesting companies come out. And then we've invested in companies like Logi360 in Africa, which is in Nigeria, which is think of it as the Uber for trucks. And what they do is they actually create efficient truck hauling systems for transport across Nigeria. It's incredible what they've been able to do. And Trade Depot, another company that we've invested in Nigeria, has helped 40,000 informal SMEs reach the formal sector and deliver product as a result of COVID in a way that they never have been able to before. So again, a platform, a digital platform that facilitates the informal to the formal and actually allowed 40,000 SMEs to survive. So I think there's so much that we need to do in digital in Africa. You'll see us doing a lot in this space.
Thank you, Stephanie. I think we could be talking about just that for a while, and I wish we had actually scheduled a lot more time, but it would be remiss of me not to take advantage of you being here today to talk a little bit about a couple of topics, which I'll try and give you in one question that a lot of folks have submitted around this theme. One, of course, is, you have been the co-chair of IFC's Diversity and Inclusion Council, and you have been in immensely influential leadership roles. And I think from your perspective, your work on the Diversity and Inclusion Council, as well as some, from your lens to see what are some of the barriers for women to be in leadership roles, especially in the developing countries or the emerging markets, for example, and what are some of the pathways for increasing opportunities for women? That would be great to hear from you.
Boy, that's a big question. Dude, I'm not even sure where to start.
I tried to condense it in 15 seconds so I don't speak too much and let you speak on it.
You know, it's interesting. I actually read this morning that UN Women is predicting that as a result of the COVID crisis, we might lose as much as 25 years of progress in relation to gender. And, you know, I think of that being the 1950s. I can't imagine myself being, you know, June Cleaver. So I'm not sure what we're going to do about that, but we got to get on it. The World Bank Group has always fostered diversity and inclusion. And just by nature of the institution that we are, we have a very diverse workforce. And that said, we still have a long way to go and a lot that we need to do. And it has as much to do with inclusion as it does diversity. And so one of the things that I'd like to see us push more on as an institution is inclusion. How do we ensure that we get the right voices at the table? You know, you're an MBA program, you understand the interesting research that's been done about what happens when you have a more diverse leadership team, your ability to make decisions. I've studied a lot of the golden skirts and all the things they've said about women on boards. But if you actually look at companies who put women on boards, they tend to have a more diverse management team. They tend to make better decisions because they have different people at the table. So in my mind, how do we get those people at the table? One of the things that we do is we actually put a lot of people on boards. So because you get what you measure, we actually have said that by 2025, 50% of all of our board seats will be held by women. So we've had a very large training program. We've reached out globally to find the right women to sit on our boards. We're at 42%, so we're pushing very hard into that. We've created some internal training programs for our women where vice presidents like myself and other vice presidents have taken women who have a lot of talent and nurtured them and mentored them so that they could step into leadership roles in a more aggressive way. I think my experience is that women tend to sit on the edge of their chair and wonder how they've gotten a job when they have 70% of the skills to do the job. And men sit down in that same chair and they might have 30% of the skills to do the job, and they lean back and say, oh, I deserve this job. So we really need to nudge women inside the institution to move forward. And then to diversity outside, we have a very interesting gender program. And it's too bad we don't have time to talk about what we do in gender, because what we do in gender is very similar to what we do in climate in terms of trying to push the agenda to help SMEs, to help women SMEs, our Banking on Women program, our WeFi program. We do a lot around gender because we do believe that we need to see more women participate in the global economy. From a political perspective, I think some emerging markets might do a little better than we do, and we might have something to learn from them politically, but that's maybe for another time too.
Well, that's great. I know we are out of time, but I just want to ask at least one more question and hope that we'll have this honor and privilege to have another conversation down the road when you'll come back on the show to actually allow us to peel more than one layer of the onion, so to speak, in this Q&A. But let me ask you, I hear all the time on how our students are coming to DC or to GW because they look at the proximity to IFC, to the World Bank, to all the institutions here. And of course, they are very, very interested in internships. For some of our students, the dream internship and the job is at the World Bank or IFC, right? And so I would love to hear your thoughts on what advice and guidance you could give them, other than good education, as to what you look for when you are looking at folks to be interning at IFC or being employed at IFC.
Well, so first, never give up. Perseverance might be the first thing. It's a difficult organization to figure out how to penetrate. So we have formal programs. We have formal internship programs. We have the YP program. I was a YP. I encourage all of you who are getting your master's or your PhD to think about the YP program. It's a really rich endeavor, and it will really change your career path. So don't give up on the formal programs. But when you think about a formal program, like the internship program might get 40 or 50,000 resumes. Just sifting through those to the couple hundred that we choose are difficult. So the second thing that I would say is, because you are literally across the street, network. Get to know people, because oftentimes internships come up because we need help with a special research project, or we need help in a sector for a summer, or we've got a portfolio issue and we need some extra hands from an analytical perspective. So continue to get to know people who know the institution, because that's another way to find really interesting internships. And honestly, in IFC, the other thing that I would say is part of our IFC 3.0 strategy was really thinking through the kind of skill sets we need as an institution. So historically, we've always hired MBAs. We've hired undergrads who have a business degree or have a CFA, who have some grounding in finance. And I think what happened to us over time is we became very much like bankers, and we weren't capable of really thinking through the most difficult development challenges in different ways. So we have started to hire in some diverse sets of skills, way more industry expertise. We've been thinking about people who have consulting backgrounds, people who have strategic backgrounds. So if you have a more diverse background, don't give up. It's probably something you should be watching in terms of the number of positions that IFC is opening up, because we do want to get some different kinds of thinkers into the organization. We know that development challenges are complex and immense, and they're going to require different sets of skills as we move forward. And the last thing I would say is, the kinds of people we're looking for: super bright, hardworking, and more than anything else, curious to learn. Because the interesting thing about the bank group is you can learn throughout your entire career. And my own career has been many jumps and many hops in different directions, all because I was curious to learn something new. So I think curiosity would probably be the last trait that I would say is one of the most important.
Thank you, Stephanie. That's great advice. It's really been an honor to have you as a guest. I feel it has been, we have gone through a range of topics. It's been a fantastic conversation from my end for this to be the season finale for George Talks Business for Fall. I would really also like to thank all of you who joined us online, and invite you to join us in our next season in the George Talks Business Series in the spring. Please stay tuned for the speaker announcements coming soon. We will continue to have amazing lineup of guests, so please follow us on social media and check our website for updates. Happy holidays, and see you in the new year. Thank you again.